The role of the media in the coverage of all terror incidents and conflict remains vital. However, where do we draw the line and what do we prioritise when daily conflicts takes place on our own continent and an isolated incident takes place in Europe or America? Is African media still finding its own voice, or have we lost our human touch for our very own people? Now, I'm joined in studio by the chairperson of the South African National Editors Forum, Mahlatse Gallens. A very good morning to you, Mahlatse. Nice to have you with us. I'm glad they let you in the building.
Good morning.
But for you, if you don't know, Mahlatse used to be deputy political editor here at SABC News, so it's great to have you back with us. But put your hat as the chairperson on quickly. You listened to the interview. I spoke to Isaac a little bit earlier, and of course he talks about context and history, and it's very much an ideological discussion that we have. On the ground, what do you see and what do we encounter?
Look, I mean, this is a topic that's very close to my heart. I spent a lot of my career traveling the continent and covering the continent. And over the years, you learn what are the difficulties with actually covering the continent. And some of those problems are not necessarily because newsrooms are not prioritizing African stories. Some of it also has to do with structural issues. For example, in a lot of the African countries, media freedom is still not guaranteed. Yeah. You know, we still have too many journalists that are living in fear of their governments. You still have too many journalists that have fled and are now living in exile. And that basically tells you that you have an exodus of talent. People have left those countries. But second issue, I mean, to talk about if there was a bomb blast, for example, somewhere in Central African Republic. If I'm a journalist now and our newsroom decided to send somebody there, first of all, to try and get a visa to go to anywhere on this continent is difficult and is on its own. Number two, the prices are also exorbitant. I mean, when we used to cover the Democratic Republic of Congo, you would pay anything from around almost 2,500 rand in terms of applying for a visa. Yeah. So for any media house, that could also be something that makes it difficult for them to go there. The process itself can take anything between 2 to 3 days or even almost a week to actually get there. And if you realize, if we're talking about something like a bomb blast, by the time that process is actually done, the story is actually over and it has also moved on. There's also practical issues around, for example, internet connection. Yeah. You know, nowadays things are supposed to be easier, you know, because of the advent of social media, people able to use their phones to actually be able to film what is happening. But in some of these countries, if it's very far-flung outside of the main cities, you find that there is no actually internet connection. So there are some really difficult issues with actually covering the continent. Another issue I have to mention is that to get to some of these countries, you probably have to leave the continent and then come back and fly back. And all of those things are issues that we need to confront as a continent to actually to try and see how do we actually make it easier for us as Africans to be able to cover our own continent. And a lot of it has to be decisions that are taken at a much higher level. You know, I'll just give you one last example. I had some very close friends of mine who were trying to open a radio station that would broadcast across the SADC region. And to be able to do that, you probably need to go to every single country to apply for a license. You know, and this, you would think this is a platform that would allow people to be able to interact with each other so that we know a lot more about each other as a continent, except just covering the conflicts, the bomb blast, and the terror attacks.
Yeah, that's true. We hardly know what people are thinking and saying in Zimbabwe, and that kind of highlights a point. All of that said, though, Black lives, do they matter enough in our newsrooms?
I think they don't matter enough. And I don't think necessarily it's because from a... it's not only just about us caring about the continent, but I think also it's about we need to put money to ensure that the Black lives do matter. The publishers, the owners of media houses need to actually invest. As I said, covering this continent is not always affordable for any media house. I mean, you look at, for example, a lot of the countries, if, for example, you have a public broadcaster, if you're lucky to have a public, most of the public broadcasters are state broadcasters, so that information is actually very controlled. So which means the private institutions would have to then step in. It means that you need to invest the money to actually find correspondence across the continent to be able to report on those stories, because we can't keep relying on agencies, for example, to be able to do those stories for us. We can't have a situation where stories are done from desktop, talking to people. It's about the human element a lot that we miss in the kind of stories that we do. So a lot of it has to do with investing. And perhaps it's also an opportunity for broadcasters across the continent to find ways of information sharing. Because that can actually help. If we've got the public broadcaster in Nigeria covering a particular issue, maybe they would have some relationship with the SABC, for example, to be able to ensure that you don't need to physically send a reporter there. I think it's about investing in actually covering the continent.
You're talking about investing, which is the important thing. Isaac mentioned something that goes with the investing, and that's experienced journalists and having people with context, people with understanding of politics and political science, for that matter. Now, when we talk about that here in South Africa, it's not been spoken about enough, I feel, but our newsrooms have been juniorized over the last decade or so, quite a bit. How do we overcome the challenges, the dual challenges of that?
Look, I think as media houses, we have to consistently put effort in ensuring that our journalists are trained. We have to retain staff. There's nothing, I mean, you can't pay enough money for institutional memory, for in-depth coverage of certain issues. But when we look at the continent, I mean, just to give a practical example, you might find that in some of these countries, there are 2 or 3 journalists that are usually used as correspondents. And you find that the story is a bit the same because everybody goes to the same correspondent to be able to cover that particular story. So it is important that we continuously invest in the newsroom. I think that as journalists perhaps become more junior, it is important that at least the editorial staff is senior enough to make sure that all of the protocols of journalism are actually covered, and to be able to ensure that we bring that balanced picture of the continent. And for me, it's not about covering only the conflicts. You know, there is a positive story about the continent that happens every single day. But if we haven't invested in covering the continent, then we will only raise alarm when the conflicts are not covered.
There's so many beautiful, you talk about the positive side of it, there's so many beautiful cities on the African continent. I'm sure you've visited quite a few of them. A country like Rwanda, for instance, is painted as a place in turmoil. But Kigali is probably the most advanced city that I've seen on the continent.
And the cleanest.
And the cleanest. Why don't we tell these stories? Why do we continue to mire ourselves in conflict?
Look, I think in the past few years, there has been a change in terms of the way we cover the continent, to look for, you know, the stories around the countries where the economies are rising despite the world economy being in the state that it is in. We are increasingly finding more and more stories of women that are breaking ground in the different industries. That is changing, but it can only be taken further if we take charge of those stories and don't send reporters to continents or to countries simply because there's a conflict. You need to invest time. Send reporters there who will spend time and be able to find those positive gems about the continent.
In 30 seconds, what should the narrative look like in 10 years' time?
I think the narrative should always reflect the reality. If Africa is rising, let it rise. But where there are conflicts, we should continue to cover those conflicts. Where there are problems, we should continue to cover those conflicts. But I think that the most important thing also is for the continent to ensure that media freedoms are respected. And that has to be a continental push, that at least journalists have the space to do the stories. Then we can critique them equally so, to say, but you've got the space to do the stories. Why are you actually not covering them? But if we've got restrictive issues around media freedom, around access to the internet, and all of those things, that still, maybe people might say is an excuse, but it is still a real barrier in covering the continent.
We don't like opposing views on the African continent. We don't, Mahlatse. Mahlatse Gallens, thank you for joining us. He's the chairperson of the South African National Editors Forum. She was also a former colleague of mine here at the SABC. She used to